millionaire hired a nurse to care for his sick 7-year-old son. One day, he came home early and was paralyzed by what he saw. Michael Carter sat alone in his grand office, the soft hum of his desktop computer, the only sound breaking the heavy silence. Outside, the expansive estate of the Carter mansion sprawled under a gray Colorado sky, its once vibrant gardens now overrun with weeds and neglect. The world Michael had built, full of wealth and prestige, felt hollow within the walls of the sprawling home he now called a fortress. The silence was familiar. It wrapped around him like an old coat, one he wore since Emily's death 7 years ago. He had poured his energy into work, building his company, expanding his reach. But despite his many accomplishments, there was always a void, a gnawing emptiness that no amount of success could fill. That void was mirrored in his other reality, his son Ethan. At just 7 years old, Ethan bore the weight of a rare autoimmune disease that left him frail and confined. His illness had become the center of Michael's world, dictating every decision, every plan. No amount of wealth or influence could ease the fear that lingered at the edge of Michael's mind. "Mr. Carter." A soft knock at the door broke his thoughts. His assistant entered, holding a neat folder. "I found another candidate for Ethan's caregiver position. Her name is Grace, and her references are impeccable." Michael glanced at the folder but didn't immediately reach for it. "Another one," he muttered. "We've been through 6 in the past year." "I understand your hesitation," she replied carefully. "But this one seems different. She's highly recommended and has significant experience with children facing medical challenges." "I really think you should meet her," Michael sighed, finally picking up the folder. He skimmed through Grace's resume without much interest. The words blurred together. Qualifications, references, accolades, but they all felt the same. "Set up the interview," he said flatly, dismissing the assistant with a wave of his hand. That evening, the familiar stillness of the mansion pressed down on Michael as he walked through its dimly lit corridors. The house, once full of life, now felt like a mausoleum. Emily had filled these halls with laughter, her voice brightening even the darkest corners. Without her, the silence was deafening, the silence. Michael paused outside Ethan's bedroom door, listening for any sign of movement. The soft rhythm of his son's breathing was all he heard. Pushing the door open, he stepped inside. Ethan lay curled up in bed, his small frame almost lost beneath the blankets. A book rested on the nightstand, untouched. "Dad?" Ethan's voice was weak, but his eyes lit up at the sight of him. "I'm here," Michael said, sitting down in the chair beside the bed. "How are you feeling?" Ethan shrugged, his pale face framed by messy brown hair. "The same," he murmured. His voice carried a weariness far beyond his years. Michael felt a pang of guilt, one that never seemed to fade. He wanted to say something comforting, something that would make it all better, but the words always failed him. Instead, he reached for the book and began to read aloud. It was a ritual they had shared since Ethan was a toddler, though now it felt more like a fragile thread connecting their two worlds. The next morning, Grace arrived for her interview. Michael greeted her in the formal living room, his demeanor as cold and guarded as ever. She was younger than he had expected, with a quiet confidence that seemed almost out of place. Her green eyes sparkled with warmth, a stark contrast to the somber atmosphere of the mansion. "Mr. Carter," she said, extending a hand. "It's a pleasure to meet you. I've heard a lot about Ethan, and I'd be honored to work with him." Michael studied her closely, searching for any hint of insincerity. Her handshake was firm, her gaze steady. Still, he couldn't help but feel skeptical. He had been disappointed too many times before. "What makes you think you're the right fit for this position?" he asked, his tone clipped. Grace didn't hesitate. "Because I care," she said simply. "I've worked with children in similar situations, and I understand how important it is to build trust. This isn't just a job to me. It's about creating a space where Ethan can feel safe, understood, and supported." Her response caught Michael off guard. He had expected rehearsed platitudes, not genuine conviction. For the first time in months, he felt a flicker of hope, but he quickly buried it beneath his usual skepticism. "You can start tomorrow," he said, rising from his chair. "But let me be clear. This is not an ordinary job. Ethan's well-being is my top priority, and I won't tolerate failure." Grace nodded, her expression unwavering. I wouldn't expect anything less." As the day wore on, Michael found himself reflecting on their brief interaction. There was something about Grace that unsettled him. A quiet strength, a determination that reminded him of someone. But he pushed the thought aside. This wasn't about him. It was about Ethan. That night, as Michael stood by his office window, staring out at the darkened estate, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. Grace's arrival had stirred something within the house, something long dormant. For the first time in years, the silence of the mansion didn't feel quite so heavy. The next morning, the Carter mansion was abuzz with rare activity. Grace arrived promptly at 8, her modest car contrasting sharply with the luxury vehicles parked in the driveway, dressed in a simple but professional outfit. She carried a small suitcase and a tote bag filled with books and supplies. Her face betrayed no nervousness, though the imposing grandeur of the mansion could have easily intimidated anyone. Michael greeted her at the door, his expression unreadable. "You're early," he remarked, stepping aside to let her in. "Punctuality is important," Grace replied with a polite smile. Glancing around the grand foyer, the high ceilings and intricate chandeliers hinted at a life of opulence, but the space felt lifeless. It was a house, not a home. Michael motioned for her to follow. "I'll show you to your quarters. You'll stay in the east wing, near Ethan's room. It's convenient for his needs." Grace nodded, trailing behind him as he walked briskly through the mansion. The polished floors echoed their footsteps, and the air carried a faint scent of lavender and wood polish. As they passed various rooms, Grace caught glimpses of the house's character, portraits lining the walls, a grand piano gathering dust, and furniture too pristine to be used. Michael paused outside a door and opened it. "This is where you'll stay. It's small, but it has everything you need." The room was simple yet elegant, with a single bed, a desk, and a large window overlooking the gardens. Grace set her suitcase down and turned to face him. "This is perfect, thank you." Michael gave a curt nod, avoiding any pleasantries. "Ethan's room is down the hall. I'll introduce you now." As they approached Ethan's door, Michael slowed his pace. The hardened exterior he usually wore seemed to soften ever so slightly. Knocking lightly, he pushed the door open. Ethan was sitting up in bed, his thin frame propped against a mound of pillows. His face lit up with curiosity at the sight of Grace. "Ethan, this is Grace," Michael said, his voice unusually gentle. "She's here to take care of you." Ethan's eyes darted between his father and Grace. "Hi," he said quietly, his tone cautious. Grace crouched down to his level, offering a warm smile. "Hi, Ethan. I've heard so much about you. I brought some books I think you might like." She reached into her tote bag and pulled out a few colorful titles. "Do you like stories about adventures?" Ethan's hesitation melted into a small smile as he nodded. "Yeah, I guess." Michael watched from the doorway, arms crossed. He wasn't sure what he had expected, but seeing Ethan respond to Grace so quickly was both a relief and an unsettling reminder of how little he understood his son's emotional needs. "I'll leave you two to get acquainted," Michael said abruptly. "I have work to do." As he left the room, Grace turned her full attention to Ethan. She sat on the edge of the bed, opening one of the books and showing him the illustrations. Her voice was calm and reassuring, and within minutes, Ethan was laughing at one of her silly impressions of a character. Meanwhile, Michael retreated to his office. Though his mind kept wandering back to the scene he had left behind, he couldn't remember the last time Ethan had laughed like that. Part of him wanted to dismiss it as beginner's luck. Grace's first impression hadn't yet worn off, but another part, a quieter and more vulnerable part, wanted to believe that she might actually make a difference. The hours passed quickly. By mid-afternoon, Grace had not only read with Ethan, but had also convinced him to leave his room for a short walk around the mansion. Michael found them in the living room, where Ethan was proudly showing her a collection of model planes. "This one's my favorite," Ethan said, holding up a sleek black aircraft. "Dad gave it to me for my birthday." Grace examined the model with genuine interest. "It's amazing. Did you put it together yourself?" Ethan shook his head. "Dad helped me. We used to build them together." Michael, standing unnoticed in the doorway, felt a pang of guilt. He couldn't remember the last time he had built something with Ethan. Work had always taken priority, and now, watching his son light up as he shared his passion, Michael realized how much he had missed. "Looks like you're settling in," Michael said, stepping into the room. Both Grace and Ethan turned to him, the latter smiling shyly. "Yes, Ethan's been a great tour guide," Grace replied warmly. "He knows so much about this house." Michael raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" Ethan nodded enthusiastically. "I showed her the library and the big clock in the hall." Michael's lips twitched, almost forming a smile. "I'm glad to see you up and about, Ethan. It's been a while." As the evening approached, Grace prepared a light dinner for Ethan, ensuring his dietary restrictions were followed to the letter. Michael observed her from a distance, noting her meticulous care and the ease with which she interacted with his son. For someone who had just arrived, she seemed to belong. Later that night, after Ethan had fallen asleep, Michael found Grace in the kitchen, tidying up. "You've had a good first day," he said, his tone neutral. Grace looked up, her expression thoughtful. "Ethan's a remarkable kid. He's been through so much, but he's still full of curiosity and kindness." Michael nodded slowly. "He gets that from his mother." A brief silence passed between them, heavy with unspoken words. Grace wanted to say more, to ask about Emily, but she held back. It was only her first day, and she knew better than to push too far. "Good night, Mr. Carter," she said softly, breaking the silence. "Good night, Grace," Michael replied, turning to leave. As he walked away, he couldn't help but feel that for the first time in years, the mansion didn't feel quite so empty. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of the Carter mansion, casting soft rays across the polished floors. Grace was already awake, having adjusted quickly to the house's quiet rhythms. She moved through the kitchen with practiced efficiency, preparing Ethan's specialized breakfast, oatmeal with a dash of honey and a handful of finely chopped fruits. Carefully portioned to meet his dietary needs, Michael entered the room just as she was finishing. His suit was immaculate, his tie perfectly knotted, and yet he carried an air of fatigue that even his polished appearance couldn't mask. "You're up early," Michael remarked, reaching for his usual black coffee. His tone was neutral, almost disinterested, but his eyes briefly flickered to the tray she had prepared. "Ethan should eat soon," Grace replied, placing the tray on the counter. "His energy levels seem better in the mornings." Michael nodded, sipping his coffee. "You've been here less than 24 hours. And you already know his schedule." Grace shrugged, her smile soft. "I pay attention." There was no sarcasm in her voice, no hidden jab, just a simple statement of fact. Michael hesitated, almost responding, but he thought better of it. Instead, he turned his attention back to his coffee as Grace carried the tray upstairs. Ethan was sitting up in bed when Grace entered, the sunlight illuminating his pale features. He greeted her with a small smile, still shy but noticeably more comfortable than the day before. "Good morning," Grace said brightly. "I brought you something special." Ethan's eyes widened as she revealed the tray, his gaze lingering on the colorful arrangement of fruit. "It looks nice," he said quietly, a hint of surprise in his voice. "Not just nice, delicious," Grace replied, sitting beside him. "But you have to eat it all. Doctor's orders." Ethan giggled, a sound so rare it caught even him by surprise. "Okay," he agreed, picking up the spoon. As he ate, Grace kept him company, asking about his favorite books, movies, and hobbies. Slowly but surely, Ethan opened up, revealing his love for airplanes, puzzles, and a particular fascination with adventure stories. Grace listened intently, her questions thoughtful and genuine, drawing him further out of his shell. "You really like planes, huh?" she said, pointing to the collection displayed on a nearby shelf. Ethan nodded enthusiastically. "Yeah, Dad used to help me build them, but he's always busy now." Grace's heart ached at the loneliness in his voice. "Maybe we can build one together sometime," she offered. "Really?" Ethan's face lit up. "Of course," Grace said. "I'll need a good teacher, though. Think you're up for the job?" Ethan grinned, the widest smile Grace had seen yet. "I can teach you." Michael watched from the doorway, unnoticed by either of them. He had intended to check in on Ethan briefly before leaving for work, but the sight of his son laughing and talking with Grace stopped him in his tracks. It was a side of Ethan he hadn't seen in years. Carefree, engaged, happy. For a moment, Michael felt a pang of something unfamiliar. Was it relief? Jealousy? Regret? He couldn't quite place it, but it lingered as he walked away. the sound of Ethan's laughter following him down the hall. Later that afternoon, Grace decided it was time for Ethan to leave his room. She coaxed him into his slippers and helped him down the hall, his small hand gripping hers for balance. They wandered through the mansion's many rooms, Grace marveling at its grandeur, while Ethan proudly pointed out his favorite spots. "This is the library," Ethan said, his voice filled with excitement as they entered a room lined with towering bookshelves. "Mom used to read to me here." Grace paused, sensing the weight of his words. "What kind of stories did she read?" "Adventure stories," Ethan replied. "She said they were the best because you could imagine going anywhere." Grace smiled, running her fingers along the spines of the books. "She sounds like she was amazing." "She was," Ethan said softly, his gaze distant. They continued their tour, eventually ending up in the living room, where Ethan showed her his model planes in more detail. Grace listened patiently as he explained the intricacies of each one, his passion shining through despite his soft-spoken nature. "Maybe we can start a new one soon," Grace suggested. "You can show me how to build it from scratch." Ethan nodded eagerly. "We should." As the afternoon wore on, Michael returned from work earlier than usual. He found them in the living room, Ethan's laughter filling the space as Grace pretended to struggle with the names of different plane models. "That's not a jet, Grace," Ethan said between giggles. "It's a biplane." "Are you sure?" Grace teased, holding the model up to inspect it. "Looks like a jet to me." Michael cleared his throat. Drawing their attention, Ethan beamed at his father. "Dad, Grace is really bad at planes." Michael raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" "She's learning," Ethan said, still smiling. "I'm teaching her." Michael's lips twitched, almost forming a smile. "Good. She could probably use a good teacher." Grace stood, brushing off her knees. "We've been making progress. Ethan's been showing me all the best spots in the house." Michael's gaze lingered on her for a moment before turning to Ethan. "It's good to see you up and about, buddy. Keep it up." "I will," Ethan said confidently, his energy brighter than Michael had seen in a long time. That evening, as Ethan slept soundly in his room, Michael found himself in the library, staring at the shelves of books that once brought his family together. He thought about the way Ethan had smiled, the way Grace had brought life back into his son's eyes. For the first time in years, he felt something shift, something that made the mansion feel a little less cold. The next few days passed in a delicate rhythm, with Grace quickly finding her footing in the Carter mansion. Ethan grew more animated with each passing day, his laughter now a regular sound that echoed through the once silent halls. Grace's genuine care for him was undeniable, and even Michael, ever the skeptic, couldn't ignore the positive changes in his son. One evening, as the sun dipped below the Colorado mountains, Michael arrived home earlier than usual. The mansion was unusually quiet, the type of stillness that always made him uneasy. He climbed the grand staircase to check on Ethan and Grace, their voices leading him toward the living room. Standing in the doorway, Michael froze. Grace was seated on the plush sofa, her back to him, holding something in her hands. Ethan sat beside her, leaning against her shoulder, looking up at her with curiosity. "I don't know why, but it makes me feel close to her," Grace said, her voice trembling slightly. Michael stepped closer, unnoticed, until he caught sight of the object in Grace's hands. It was an old photograph, one of the few he kept of Emily, taken on the day they had moved into the mansion. She was radiant in the image, holding a much younger Ethan in her arms, her smile wide and unguarded. Michael's breath caught in his throat. "What are you doing?" His voice came out sharper than he intended. Grace jumped, nearly dropping the photograph. "Mr. Carter," she started, rising to her feet. Ethan clung to her arm, looking up at his father with wide eyes. "Dad, Ethan, go to your room," Michael interrupted, his gaze fixed on Grace. His tone left no room for argument. Ethan hesitated, glancing nervously between the two adults before slipping off the sofa and retreating down the hall. The air in the room grew heavy as Michael took another step forward. "Why were you holding that?" he demanded, his eyes narrowing. Grace swallowed hard, her composure faltering for the first time since she'd arrived. She hesitated, then met his gaze. "I didn't mean to pry. I found it on the bookshelf while I was organizing, and I couldn't help myself." Michael's jaw tightened. That's not an answer. Grace's hands trembled as she placed the photograph carefully on the table between them. It's just seeing her face. It brought back so many questions, things I've been trying to piece together since I was a child. Michael's frown deepened. What are you talking about? Grace took a deep breath, her voice barely above a whisper. I know this might sound unbelievable, but I think Emily was my mother. The words hit Michael like a physical blow. For a moment, he thought he had misheard her. What? He asked, his voice low and disbelieving. Grace didn't flinch. I found out a few months ago. I grew up in foster care, but I always knew I had a different story. A few years ago, I started looking into my past and I discovered Emily's name on an old birth certificate. When this job came up, I thought, maybe I could finally get answers. Michael's mind reeled, his carefully constructed world threatening to unravel. Emily, the woman he had loved so deeply, the mother of his child, had never mentioned another child. Could it be true? Or was this some elaborate ploy? That's absurd, he said, his tone cold and dismissive. Emily would have told me. Grace took a cautious step forward. I don't know why she didn't, but I'm not here to cause trouble, Mr. Carter. I'm here for Ethan. He's my brother. At least I think he is. Stop, Michael snapped, his voice rising. This is ridiculous. You've overstepped, Grace. I trusted you with my son, not this. Grace's face fell, but she held her ground. I understand this is hard to hear. I didn't plan for you to find out like this, but the truth is, I care about Ethan. More than you realize. Michael turned away. Pacing toward the window, he stared out at the darkening landscape, his mind churning. Could she be lying? Her demeanor didn't suggest deception, but the idea was too much to process. After a long silence, he finally spoke. You're here to care for Ethan. That's it. Whatever theory you have about your past doesn't matter. Do your job and stay out of my family's personal history. Grace's heart sank, but she nodded. I'll respect your wishes, Mr. Carter. Without another word, Michael left the room, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. Grace sank back onto the sofa, her hands trembling. She had hoped the truth might bring clarity, but instead, it had created a new rift. In his office, Michael sat at his desk, staring at the same photograph Grace had been holding. The smile on Emily's face felt like a taunt, as if she were laughing at him from beyond the grave. Could she really have kept such a monumental secret? And if so, why? The questions haunted him through the night, and by morning, he was no closer to an answer. The morning dawned gray and heavy, mirroring the tension that lingered in the Carter mansion. Grace rose early, her sleep restless after the previous evening's confrontation. She couldn't shake the image of Michael's face, his anger, his disbelief, but beneath it all, she had seen something else. Doubt, a sliver of hesitation that told her he wasn't entirely certain she was wrong. In Ethan's room, she found him sitting up in bed, his favorite book in his lap. He looked up as she entered, his expression a mix of curiosity and worry. Are you okay? Ethan asked, his small voice breaking the silence. Grace forced a smile. I'm fine, champ. How about you? Feeling up for breakfast? Ethan nodded but didn't move to get out of bed. Instead, he frowned slightly. Dad seemed mad last night. Grace hesitated, unsure how much to say. Your dad just had a lot on his mind. Don't worry, okay? Everything's fine. Ethan didn't seem entirely convinced, but he let the subject drop as Grace helped him out of bed and into his slippers. They made their way to the dining room, where Michael was already seated with a cup of coffee and a tablet. Skimming through emails, he barely looked up as they entered. Good morning, Dad, Ethan said, his voice unusually bright, as if testing the waters. Morning, Michael replied, his tone flat. His gaze flicked briefly to Grace before returning to the screen. The silence at the table was oppressive. Grace busied herself preparing Ethan's plate, her movements deliberate as she avoided looking at Michael. But as she handed Ethan his plate, she couldn't take the tension anymore. Mr. Carter, she began carefully, I think we should talk. Michael set down his coffee, his eyes narrowing. Not here, Grace nodded, understanding the unspoken command. After helping Ethan get settled with his meal, she followed Michael into his office. He closed the door behind them, the sound sharp and final. Michael leaned against his desk, arms crossed. You said enough last night." "I don't think I did," Grace countered, her voice steady despite the fear twisting in her stomach. "You need to know why I'm here." Michael's eyes darkened. "I already know why. You wanted to get close to my son under the guise of some absurd story about Emily." "It's not a story," Grace interrupted, her voice rising slightly. "I've spent years trying to understand where I came from. Do you know what it's like to grow up without answers? To feel like a part of you is missing?" Michael's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Grace took a deep breath and continued. "When I was a teenager, I found a box of documents from the foster care system. There wasn't much, but there was a name, Emily Carter. I didn't think much of it at first, but the name stuck with me. Years later, when I started digging deeper, I found the birth certificate. Her name was listed as the mother, but the father's name was blank. That's when I knew I had to find out more." Michael shook his head, his disbelief apparent. "Even if that's true, why come here? Why not contact me directly?" Grace hesitated, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I didn't think you'd believe me, and honestly, I didn't know what I was looking for. But when I saw the job posting, I thought, maybe I could meet Ethan first. Maybe I could find a way to understand what kind of person Emily was." Michael stared at her, his expression unreadable. The weight of her words hung between them, and for the first time, he didn't immediately dismiss her. Instead, he turned toward the window, his gaze distant. "Emily never mentioned you," he said after a long silence. "Not once." "I don't know why," Grace admitted, her voice soft. "Maybe she thought it was better that way. Maybe she was trying to protect you or Ethan. I'll never know. But I'm not here to hurt anyone, Mr. Carter. I'm here because I care about Ethan. And whether you believe me or not, he's my brother." Michael's grip on the windowsill tightened. The revelation felt like a storm battering the edges of his carefully constructed world. If Grace was telling the truth, it meant Emily had hidden a part of her life from him, a part that now stood in his home, challenging everything he thought he knew. Finally, he turned back to Grace, his face hard, but his voice calm. "You're here to take care of Ethan, that's all. Do your job and we won't have a problem." Grace swallowed hard, her heart sinking. "And what about the truth? Doesn't that matter?" Michael's eyes flashed with something she couldn't quite name. Pain, perhaps, or frustration. "The truth," he said evenly, "doesn't change the fact that I'm the one raising Ethan, not you." Before she could respond, Michael opened the door. Signaling the end of the conversation, Grace stepped out into the hallway, her chest tight with emotion. As the door closed behind her, she realized that while she might never have the answers she sought, she wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. That night, Michael sat alone in his office, the photograph of Emily once again in his hands. He studied her face, searching for clues in the smile that had once brought him so much comfort. Could she have really kept such a secret? And if she had, what else might she have been hiding? For the first time in years, Michael felt truly uncertain. Not about Grace, but about the woman he had loved and trusted. And that uncertainty terrified him. The Carter mansion seemed quieter than usual in the days following Grace's confession. The tension between her and Michael was palpable, casting a shadow over the newfound brightness Grace had brought into Ethan's life. Despite the progress Ethan was making, the air felt heavy, and the fragile peace in the house teetered on the edge of collapse. Michael buried himself in work, spending more time than ever in his office. He convinced himself that focusing on business was the best way to regain control. But deep down, he couldn't escape the lingering questions Grace had stirred. Every time he looked at Ethan, he wondered if there was a piece of Emily's past he had failed to see. Grace, on the other hand, channeled her energy into Ethan's care. She avoided Michael as much as possible, knowing her presence only seemed to aggravate him. Instead, she poured her attention into Ethan, who continued to thrive under her watch. One afternoon, as Michael returned from the office earlier than usual, he found Grace and Ethan in the backyard. Ethan was sitting on a picnic blanket, his pale face lit up with a rare smile as Grace handed him a small model airplane kit. "You think we can finish it today?" Ethan asked eagerly. "We'll give it our best shot," Grace replied, her tone warm and encouraging. "But only if you promise to be the boss. I'm still learning, remember?" Ethan giggled, his laugh carrying across the yard. Michael lingered near the back door, watching them from a distance. For a fleeting moment, He felt something unfamiliar. Relief. Maybe even gratitude. Grace had brought Ethan back to life in a way he hadn't seen since Emily's death, but then he remembered the words Grace had said in his office, the questions she had raised about Emily's past. The flicker of gratitude was snuffed out, replaced by a wave of frustration. He stepped outside, his presence immediately catching Grace's attention. "Mr. Carter," Grace said, standing quickly. Ethan looked up, his smile fading slightly as he noticed the tension between them. "Ethan," Michael said, keeping his tone neutral. "It's time to come inside. We don't want you getting too tired." Ethan hesitated, glancing at Grace, who gave him a reassuring nod. "We'll finish the plane later," she promised. As Ethan gathered his things, Michael turned to Grace. "A word," he said tersely, motioning for her to follow him. Inside the house, Michael led Grace to the kitchen, his movements stiff and deliberate. He turned to face her, his expression a mix of exhaustion and irritation. "Whatever you're trying to do here," he began, his voice low but firm. "It stops now." Grace frowned. "What are you talking about?" "This bond you're forming with Ethan," Michael said, gesturing vaguely. "I'm not going to let you use him to get closer to me or to dig up whatever it is you think you need to know about Emily." Grace's cheeks flushed with anger. "I'm not using Ethan," she said sharply. "I care about him. He's a child who deserves love and attention, and if you can't see that, then maybe you're the one who needs to take a closer look at yourself." Michael's eyes narrowed, his posture stiffening. "Watch your tone," he warned. "You're here because I allowed it, not because you have some right to be part of this family." "Allowed it," Grace shot back, her voice trembling with emotion. "Do you think this is easy for me? Walking into this house, knowing what I know, trying to be part of Ethan's life without overstepping. I've done everything I can to respect your boundaries, but I won't stand by while you accuse me of manipulation." Michael's jaw tightened, his hands gripping the edge of the counter. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence in the room stretching like a taut rope about to snap. Finally, Grace took a deep breath, her tone softening. "Mr. Carter, I'm not your enemy. I'm not here to take anything from you. I want to be here for Ethan. He's my brother, whether you believe it or not." Michael turned away, his gaze fixed on the window. "You don't know that for sure." Grace hesitated. "Maybe not, but in my heart I feel it's true. And even if I'm wrong, Ethan is still a little boy who needs someone to care about him." Michael didn't respond, his silence speaking volumes. Grace took it as her cue to leave, retreating to her room with a heavy heart. That night, Michael sat in his office, staring at a stack of old photo albums. He hadn't opened them in years. The memories they held too painful to confront. But now, with Grace's words echoing in his mind, he felt compelled to search for answers. Flipping through the pages, he found images of Emily smiling, holding Ethan as a baby, and standing in the very backyard where Grace and Ethan had been earlier. She looked radiant, carefree, and utterly devoted to their son. But there was nothing, no hint, no clue, that suggested she had another child. Michael closed the album, his frustration mounting. If Grace was telling the truth, why had Emily hidden it from him? And if she wasn't, what was her real motive? For the first time in years, Michael felt completely untethered, unsure of what to believe. The next morning, Grace found Ethan unusually quiet at breakfast. She crouched beside him, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. "Everything okay, champ?" she asked gently. Ethan looked up at her, his eyes wide and uncertain. "Dad seems upset. Did I do something wrong?" Grace's heart ached. "No, sweetie, you didn't do anything wrong. Your dad just has a lot on his mind." Ethan nodded slowly, but the worry didn't leave his face. Grace glanced toward Michael, who was seated at the far end of the table, his expression distant. She knew their unspoken battle was taking a toll on more than just themselves. It was affecting Ethan, too. Something had to change. But for now, all Grace could do was wait. The days following Michael's confrontation with Grace were marked by an uneasy truce. They barely exchanged words, their interactions limited to polite but strained acknowledgments. Grace focused on Ethan, pouring her energy into ensuring his happiness and well-being. Michael, meanwhile, immersed himself in work, avoiding both Grace and the questions that had begun to haunt him. Ethan, however, wasn't oblivious to the tension. He could sense the unspoken conflict between his father and Grace. And though neither of them said anything in his presence, their strained silences spoke volumes. For a child as perceptive as Ethan, it was impossible to ignore. One afternoon, Grace found Ethan sitting cross-legged on his bed, staring at a model airplane in his hands. His expression was distant, his usually bright eyes clouded with thought. "What's on your mind, champ?" Grace asked, sitting down beside him. Ethan looked up at her, hesitating before speaking. "Is Dad mad at you?" Grace's heart sank. She had tried so hard to shield him from the tension in the house, but Ethan's question confirmed what she already suspected. He felt it too. "Your dad's just..." Grace paused, searching for the right words. "He has a lot on his plate right now, but he's not mad at me, and he's definitely not mad at you." Ethan frowned, his small fingers tracing the edges of the model plane. "He doesn't talk to me as much anymore." Grace felt a pang of sympathy. "He loves you, Ethan. Sometimes grown-ups get so busy or worried that they forget to show it the way they should, but that doesn't mean he doesn't care." Ethan was quiet for a moment, then asked softly, "Do you care about me?" Grace's throat tightened. "Of course I do," she said, her voice steady but full of emotion. "You're an amazing kid, Ethan, and I'll always be here for you, even if Dad doesn't want you to be," he whispered. Grace's breath caught. "Your dad's just trying to figure some things out, but no matter what happens, I promise you this, I'll always do what's best for you, okay?" Ethan nodded, his gaze steady. "I don't want you to leave." That evening, as Michael sat at the dining table finishing some paperwork, Ethan approached him, clutching his favorite model plane. Michael glanced up, surprised by the determined expression on his son's face. "What's up, buddy?" Michael asked, setting his pen down. Ethan climbed onto the chair across from him, placing the plane carefully on the table. "I want to talk." Michael raised an eyebrow, leaning back in his chair. "Okay, what's on your mind?" Ethan hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I don't want Grace to leave." Michael's expression faltered. "What makes you think she's leaving? Because you don't like her," Ethan said plainly, his voice small but unwavering. "You're always mad at her, but she makes me happy." Michael stared at his son, taken aback by his candor. "Ethan, I'm not mad at Grace." "You act like you are," Ethan pressed. "And she's the only one who spends time with me. She helps me build planes, and she reads stories, and she listens. You used to do that, but now you don't." The words hit Michael harder than he expected. He had always told himself that his long hours and rigid focus on work were for Ethan's sake, for his future, his medical care. But hearing his son's quiet accusation forced him to confront the painful truth. He had been so consumed by his own grief and responsibilities that he had let their relationship slip away. "I'm sorry, buddy," Michael said finally, his voice soft. "You're right. I haven't been there for you the way I should." Ethan's eyes widened slightly, as if he hadn't expected his father to admit it. "Does that mean Grace can stay?" Michael sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Grace is here to help you, and she's doing a great job. I'm not going to take that away from you." Ethan smiled, the first genuine smile Michael had seen from him in days. "Thanks, Dad." Michael nodded, his heart heavy but resolute. If nothing else, he owed Ethan the stability and happiness Grace seemed to bring him, even if her presence stirred emotions he wasn't ready to face. The next morning, Michael found Grace in the kitchen, preparing Ethan's breakfast as usual. She looked up as he entered, her expression cautious but polite. "Good morning," Michael said, his tone more measured than it had been in days. "Good morning," Grace replied. Surprised by his softened demeanor, Michael hesitated before speaking again. "I wanted to thank you for everything you've been doing for Ethan. He's been happier these past few weeks than I've seen him in years." Grace blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected acknowledgement. "That means a lot, Mr. Carter. He's an incredible kid." Michael nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "He wants you to stay." Grace felt her chest tighten. "And what do you want?" Michael didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked past her, as though searching for something in the distance. "I want what's best for him," he said finally. "And right now, that's you." Grace exhaled, relief washing over her. "I won't let you down." Michael met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "You'd better not." As the day unfolded, the atmosphere in the mansion began to shift. Michael, though still reserved, seemed more present, making an effort to engage with Ethan. Grace noticed the change and felt a flicker of hope that perhaps, despite their differences, they could find a way to coexist for Ethan's sake. But as night fell and Michael retreated to his office, the questions that had been gnawing at him returned. Grace's presence was undeniable, her care for Ethan genuine, yet the mystery of her connection to Emily lingered, casting a long shadow over his thoughts. For now, Michael resolved to set those questions aside. Ethan needed stability, and Grace had proven she could provide it. But in the back of his mind, he knew the truth couldn't stay buried forever. The Carter mansion slowly began to breathe again, its heavy silence replaced by the occasional burst of laughter from Ethan, or the low hum of conversation in the kitchen. Grace's presence had become an undeniable force, one that brought warmth and light to the house. Even Michael, though still guarded, found himself drawn into the small moments she created. One crisp morning, Grace decided it was time for Ethan to spend some time outside again. She found him in his room, flipping through an old picture book, his concentration broken by a soft knock on the door. "Hey, champ," Grace said, peeking in. "How about some fresh air today? We could take a walk in the garden." Ethan looked up, his face lighting up at the suggestion. "Can we take the plane too?" Grace grinned. "Absolutely. You can show me your best launch." Within minutes, Ethan was bundled up in a light jacket, holding his favorite model plane tightly as they stepped outside. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of leaves and earth. Grace led Ethan to the garden, where the once neglected flowers had begun to show signs of care, a project she had taken on during her free moments. "Wow," Ethan said, pointing to a patch of blooming chrysanthemums. "They're growing. They just needed a little attention," Grace replied, crouching down to inspect a bud. "Kind of like you," Ethan giggled, his laughter carrying through the open space. He launched his plane into the air, watching as it glided a few feet before landing softly in the grass. Grace clapped enthusiastically, making a show of how impressed she was. "Not bad, pilot," she said. "I think you're getting the hang of it." Ethan beamed, his smile wide and unguarded. Michael, watching from a distance on the terrace, felt an unfamiliar warmth spread through his chest. He hadn't planned to stay home that morning, but something about the sight of Ethan and Grace made it impossible to leave. After lunch, Michael approached Grace as she was tidying up in the kitchen. He cleared his throat, and she turned, startled by his presence. "Mr. Carter?" she said, her tone polite but cautious. "I wanted to ask if you'd be open to having dinner with Ethan and me tonight," Michael said, his words coming out slower than usual. "It's been a while since we've had a proper family meal." Grace blinked, caught off guard by the invitation. "Of course," she replied. "That sounds wonderful." Michael gave a small nod and left the room without another word. Grace stared after him, a mixture of surprise and curiosity swirling in her mind. It wasn't like Michael to extend an olive branch. However small, perhaps this was a step toward something more. That evening, the dining room was a different space. The usual formality seemed to dissolve as Grace and Ethan chatted animatedly about their afternoon adventures in the garden. Michael, though quieter, listened intently, occasionally adding a comment or a question that drew more laughter from Ethan. As the meal progressed, Michael found himself watching Grace, not with suspicion, but with a growing sense of respect. Her patience with Ethan, her easy laughter, the way she seemed to bring life to the mansion. It was all undeniable. For the first time, Michael allowed himself to wonder if she might truly be connected to Emily in the way she claimed. "Ethan," Grace said, turning to the boy as he finished his dessert. "Do you want to show your dad the picture we drew earlier?" Ethan's face lit up. "Yeah, I'll go get it." He hopped down from his chair and ran out of the room, leaving Grace and Michael alone. The silence between them was thick but not entirely uncomfortable. "You're good with him," Michael said finally, breaking the quiet. Grace looked up, surprised. "He makes it easy. He's a wonderful kid." Michael nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "He's been through a lot. Losing Emily, it changed everything." Grace hesitated, sensing the vulnerability in his voice. "It's clear how much you love him, and he knows that, even if you don't always show it the way you want to." Michael's lips pressed into a thin line. her words hitting closer to home than he expected. Before he could respond, Ethan came bounding back into the room, clutching a crayon drawing. "Look, Dad," Ethan said, holding the picture up proudly. "Grace and I made this together." Michael leaned forward to examine the drawing. It showed the three of them in the garden, with Ethan in the center holding his model plane. Though simple and childlike, the image was striking in its warmth. Michael felt a lump rise in his throat, but he quickly swallowed it down. "It's great, buddy," he said, ruffling Ethan's hair. "You're quite the artist." Ethan beamed, climbing back into his chair. Grace watched the interaction with a soft smile, feeling a flicker of hope that perhaps the walls Michael had built were beginning to crack. Later that night, after Ethan had gone to bed, Grace sat in her room, reflecting on the day. She couldn't ignore the shift she had felt at dinner. The way Michael had softened, however slightly, it was a small step, but it felt significant. In his office, Michael sat at his desk, the crayon drawing now resting beside his laptop. He stared at it for a long time, his mind filled with thoughts of Emily, Ethan, and Grace. Could it really be possible that Grace was telling the truth? And if she was, what did that mean for the family he had tried so hard to protect? As the house settled into silence, both Grace and Michael found themselves caught in the same thought, the realization that, despite everything, they were starting to feel like a family. The following morning, Michael sat in his office, the crayon drawing still resting on his desk, the cheerful image of Ethan. Grace and himself lingered in his mind, though it brought more questions than comfort. If Grace's story was true, Emily had kept a monumental secret from him, and yet, the thought of confronting the past filled him with equal parts dread and curiosity, driven by a need for answers. Michael unlocked a drawer in his desk that he hadn't touched in years. Inside was a worn, leather-bound journal, a collection of letters Emily had written but never sent. He had kept them after her passing, unable to read them at the time but unable to let them go. That evening, after Ethan had gone to bed, Michael sat in the dimly lit library, flipping through the journal. The pages were filled with Emily's looping handwriting, her thoughts and emotions laid bare. Most entries spoke of their early years together, her love for Ethan, and her dreams for their family. But near the end, the tone shifted. One entry in particular caught his attention. "There are things I've never told Michael, things I'm afraid he'd never forgive me for, but every time I look at Ethan, I know I made the right choice. My past is something I'll carry alone. This family deserves peace." Michael's breath caught. What had she meant? Was it possible Grace's story was true? And if so, why had Emily kept it a secret? The words echoed in his mind long after he closed the journal. For years, he had idolized Emily, believing she had been open and honest in their marriage. But this revelation left him feeling unmoored, as if the foundation of his memories had begun to crack. The next morning, Grace was in the kitchen preparing Ethan's breakfast when Michael entered, his expression unreadable. She looked up, surprised to see him so early. "Good morning," she said cautiously. Michael nodded but didn't return the greeting. Instead, he leaned against the counter, studying her intently. "Grace," he began, his voice measured. "Do you have proof of what you told me?" Grace set down the knife she'd been using to slice fruit, her heart racing. "Proof," she echoed. "Yes," Michael said. "Something concrete, a document, a photograph, anything that connects you to Emily." Grace hesitated, her mind racing. "I have the birth certificate," she said finally. "It lists her name as my mother, but it's old and, well, I know that might not be enough for you." Michael crossed his arms, his gaze unwavering. "Show me." An hour later, they were sitting in the living room. Grace had retrieved the document from her room, and now it sat between them on the coffee table. Michael leaned forward, scanning the faded piece of paper. There it was, Emily Carter listed as the mother. The father's name was absent, leaving a void that only deepened Michael's uncertainty. "This doesn't make sense," he murmured, more to himself than to Grace. "If this is true, why wouldn't she have told me? I've been asking myself the same question for years," Grace said softly. "I don't have all the answers, Mr. Carter. I just know what I've found." Michael leaned back, rubbing his temples. The weight of the discovery pressed heavily on him. If Grace was truly Emily's daughter, it meant his late wife had hidden a part of herself, a part that now sat before him, entwined with his family's future. That afternoon, Michael retreated to his office. The journal lay open on his desk. Alongside the birth certificate, he pored over the details, searching for anything that might fill in the gaps. The questions haunted him. Why had Emily kept this from him? And if Grace was truly her daughter, how had she ended up in foster care? The memories of their life together resurfaced. Tinged now with doubt, Emily had always been fiercely protective of Ethan, often saying he was her second chance at happiness. Had she been referring to a first child, one she had been forced to give up? Or was there another explanation he had yet to uncover? Meanwhile, Grace focused on Ethan. Keeping their daily routine as normal as possible, she couldn't help but notice the way Michael's mood had shifted. He was quieter, more introspective, his usual sharpness dulled by something heavier. That evening, as she helped Ethan with a puzzle in the living room, Michael appeared in the doorway. His expression was calm but unreadable. "Grace," he said, his voice softer than she'd expected. "Can we talk?" Grace glanced at Ethan, who was too engrossed in his puzzle to notice the tension in the room. She nodded, following Michael into the study. He closed the door behind them, leaning against the edge of the desk. "I've been going through some of Emily's things," he began, his tone deliberate. "Her journals, old letters, I found hints. Nothing definitive, but enough to make me think she might have been hiding something." Grace's heart pounded. "What does that mean?" "It means I'm not dismissing what you've told me," Michael said, his gaze steady. "But I need time to process this, and I need to be certain before I make any decisions about what it means for Ethan. For us." Grace exhaled, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. "I understand. I never wanted to cause trouble, Mr. Carter. I just wanted to be here for Ethan." Michael studied her for a long moment before nodding. "You've been good for him," he admitted. "Better than I could have expected. That's not something I take lightly." The words hung between them, fragile but meaningful. For the first time, Grace felt a glimmer of hope that they might find a way forward. Together, that night, Michael returned to the journal, flipping through its pages once more. Emily's words felt like whispers from the past, urging him to uncover the truth she had tried so hard to bury. He didn't know where the journey would lead, but one thing was certain: he couldn't ignore it any longer. Michael spent the next few days immersed in a storm of emotions. The journal, the birth certificate, and Grace's quiet conviction all pointed to a truth he wasn't ready to face. For years, he had held Emily's memory as sacred, believing their love had been built on complete honesty. But now, doubts clawed at his mind, demanding answers he wasn't sure he wanted. One evening, after Ethan had gone to bed, Michael found himself standing outside Grace's door. His hand hovered over the polished wood, hesitant. Confronting her felt like opening a door he couldn't close, but he couldn't avoid it any longer. Finally, he knocked. "Come in," Grace called softly. Michael entered, his posture rigid, his expression guarded. Grace was sitting on the edge of her bed, a book open in her lap. She closed it quickly, sensing the gravity of his visit. "I've been thinking," Michael began, his voice low, "about everything you've said about Emily." Grace straightened, her heart pounding. "And?" Michael sat in the chair near the window, his gaze distant. "I can't ignore the possibility that you're telling the truth. But if you are, it means Emily kept a part of her life from me, a part that could change everything I thought I knew about her." Grace's throat tightened. "I'm not trying to tarnish her memory, Mr. Carter. She was clearly an incredible woman, but I can't ignore what I found either." Michael nodded slowly, his fingers tapping against the arm of the chair. "If Emily was your mother, then how did you end up in foster care? Why didn't she raise you?" Grace hesitated, her eyes flickering with uncertainty. "I don't know. That's the part I've never been able to figure out. The records I've found don't explain why I was given up, but I've always believed there had to be a reason." Michael leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "If there's one thing I knew about Emily, it's that she wouldn't have let go of a child without a fight. If she gave you up, she must have had no other choice." The words surprised even him. Despite his anger and confusion, a part of him still clung to the belief that Emily's actions, however hidden, had been rooted in love. "I need more answers," Michael said finally. "I need to know the full story." Grace nodded, her gaze steady. I want to know, too. If there's anything I can do to help, I will. Michael stood, his resolve hardening. There might be a way. Emily kept journals, letters, pieces of her life she never shared with me. Maybe there's something in there that can give us the answers we're looking for. The next morning, Michael retrieved the box of journals and letters from his office. He placed it on the coffee table in the living room, where Grace was waiting. The box was old and worn, its edges frayed from years of storage. "These are all the things Emily left behind," Michael said, his tone clipped. "Some of it might not mean anything, but it's a place to start." Grace reached for the box with trembling hands. She opened it slowly, revealing a collection of notebooks, loose papers, and photographs. The sight of Emily's handwriting brought an unexpected wave of emotion, and for a moment, Grace couldn't speak. "Take your time," Michael said gruffly. Stepping back to give her space, Grace nodded, carefully pulling out the first journal. She flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning Emily's words. Most of the entries were about Ethan, his birth, his milestones, the joy he brought to her life. But as she reached the later pages, the tone shifted. One entry caught her attention immediately. The date matched the year listed on her birth certificate. "There are some things I can never tell Michael. It would destroy him. But the choice I made then, it was the hardest thing I've ever done. I thought it would bring peace, but it's a burden I'll carry forever." Grace's voice trembled as she read the passage aloud. Michael, standing a few feet away, felt the words hit him like a physical blow. Emily's confession, though vague, confirmed his worst fears. She had carried a secret so heavy it had shaped her life, and perhaps her death. "There's more," Grace said, flipping to the next page. "I wanted to keep her. I wanted to fight for her, but I wasn't strong enough. The circumstances were impossible, and I had to make a choice. Letting her go was the only way to protect her. But I'll never forgive myself for it." Grace's voice broke, tears spilling down her cheeks. Michael remained silent, his mind reeling. He couldn't reconcile the woman he had loved with the one described in these pages, a woman forced to make an unimaginable sacrifice. After a long silence, Michael finally spoke. "If this is true, if you're the child she gave up, then you deserve to know why. We both do." That evening, Michael sat alone in his office, staring at the journal in his hands. Emily's words replayed in his mind, each one a puzzle piece that refused to fit neatly into the picture he had of her. He thought of Grace, of the life she must have led without the mother who had loved her so deeply, and then he thought of Ethan. How would he explain all of this to his son? How could he help Ethan understand a truth that he barely grasped himself? Michael's thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Grace entered, her face still marked by the tears she had shed earlier. "I wanted to thank you," she said quietly, "for trusting me enough to share those journals. I know how much she meant to you." Michael nodded, his expression softening. "She meant everything to me, and if you're really her daughter, then that means you're a part of her too." Grace's breath hitched, her heart swelling with a mix of relief and gratitude. For the first time, she saw a glimmer of acceptance in Michael's eyes, a willingness to face the truth. "No matter how painful it might be, we'll figure this out," Michael said firmly. Together, the air in the Carter mansion was heavier than ever, though now it carried the weight of discovery rather than silence. Grace's presence, once a question mark in Michael's carefully ordered life, was becoming something more, a thread connecting past and present. Yet, amidst this fragile hope, Ethan's health began to decline. It started subtly. Ethan was more tired than usual, his energy waning during activities he once enjoyed. Grace noticed first, her trained eye picking up on the signs. Before Michael even realized, Ethan's laughter became less frequent, and his walks in the garden grew shorter. One afternoon, Grace found Michael in his office, staring at yet another of Emily's journals. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice urgent but measured, "we need to talk about Ethan." Michael looked up, his brow furrowing. "What's wrong?" "He's not doing well," Grace said, sitting in the chair across from him. "I've noticed his energy levels dropping, and he's been more fatigued. It could be a flare-up of his condition, but it's serious." Michael's grip on the journal tightened. "What do we need to do?" "I think he needs to see his specialist again," Grace said. "And in the meantime, We should focus on keeping him as comfortable and stress-free as possible. Michael nodded, his expression grim. I'll make the call. Grace hesitated. There's something else. He's been asking questions about family, about his mom. I think it's on his mind more than he lets on. Michael exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. He's too young to understand all of this. I don't even understand all of it. But he deserves the truth, Grace said gently. In a way he can handle, of course. But he needs to feel secure, to know he's loved. That's what matters most. Michael's gaze lingered on her, a mixture of gratitude and apprehension in his eyes. You've become important to him, he admitted. I didn't want to admit it at first, but it's clear. He looks at you like... He paused, the words catching in his throat. Like a sister, Grace finished, her voice soft. Michael nodded. Yes. The next day, Michael accompanied Grace and Ethan to the specialist's office. It had been months since Michael had taken Ethan himself, and the visit reminded him of how much he had relied on Grace to fill the gaps he had left. Watching her interact with the doctors, advocating for Ethan with a confidence born of both experience and love, stirred something deep within him as they drove back to the mansion. Ethan dozed in the back seat, his small frame curled under a blanket. Michael glanced at Grace, who sat silently beside him, her hands folded in her lap. I've been thinking, Michael said, breaking the silence, about what you said earlier, about Ethan needing to feel secure. Grace turned to him, her expression unreadable. And I don't want him to feel like he's missing something, Michael continued. He's been through enough already, if you're willing. I'd like you to stay, not just as his caregiver, but as part of the family. Grace's breath caught. She had been prepared for many things, for rejection, for doubt, but not this. You mean that? Michael nodded, his eyes steady. I do. You've done more for him than I have in years. I can't ignore that. A small, tearful smile broke across Grace's face. Thank you, she said softly that evening, as they gathered in the living room. Ethan was unusually quiet. He sat on the sofa, wrapped in a blanket, while Grace and Michael tried to engage him with stories and games. Finally, Ethan looked up, his gaze settling on Michael. Dad, he said, his voice weak but steady. Am I going to get better? Michael's heart clenched. He glanced at Grace, who gave him a small nod, urging him to be honest. We're doing everything we can, buddy, Michael said, kneeling beside him. You're stronger than you think. Ethan frowned slightly, his small hands clutching the edge of the blanket. Grace makes me feel strong. She says I can do anything. She's right, Michael said, his voice firm. You can. Ethan smiled faintly, then looked at Grace. You won't leave, will you? Grace's throat tightened. No, Ethan, I'm not going anywhere, I promise. That night, after Ethan had fallen asleep, Michael and Grace sat together in the kitchen, the weight of the day pressing down on them. Thank you for being here, Michael said quietly. For him, for everything. Grace looked at him, her eyes shining with emotion. I wouldn't be anywhere else. Michael nodded, his expression softening. I've spent so much time trying to protect Ethan, trying to shield him from the world, but maybe what he needed most was someone like you, someone who could give him what I couldn't. You've done more for him than you realize, Grace said gently. He knows how much you love him. That's what matters. Michael's gaze lingered on her, the walls he had built around himself beginning to crumble. For the first time, he allowed himself to see Grace not as an outsider, but as a part of their family, a piece of Emily's legacy that had come back to them when they needed it most. As the mansion settled into silence, Michael found himself standing outside Ethan's room, watching his son sleep. The fragility of the moment was overwhelming, but it was tempered by a newfound resolve. Whatever the future held, they would face it together. As a family, the following morning, the mansion was filled with a quieter, almost contemplative energy. The previous night's conversation lingered in Michael's mind, a mixture of relief and responsibility settling over him. For the first time in years, he felt like his family wasn't just surviving, it was beginning to heal. Ethan was still asleep when Michael found Grace in the kitchen, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. She looked up as he entered, her expression soft but guarded. How is he this morning? Michael asked, pouring himself a cup of coffee. Grace shrugged slightly. Still tired, but his spirits seem better. I think he's happy knowing he's not alone. Michael nodded. Taking a sip of his coffee, the silence between them was comfortable, a far cry from the tension that had once defined their interactions. Finally, Michael set his cup down and looked at Grace, his expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began. "About the truth." Grace raised an eyebrow. "And I owe it to Ethan," Michael admitted. "And to you, if Emily really was your mother, if she kept this part of her life hidden. We need to know why." Grace's breath caught. She had spent so long searching for answers, but hearing Michael say it out loud made the need for clarity feel even more urgent. "I want to help you figure it out," Michael continued, "but I need you to be honest with me. About everything." Grace nodded, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "I promise." That afternoon, Michael and Grace returned to the box of Emily's journals and letters. They worked side by side in the library. The crackling fireplace, the only sound as they combed through pages of Emily's thoughts. Most of the entries were familiar, filled with reflections on Ethan's milestones and her love for Michael. But as they neared the end of the journals, the tone began to shift. "This one's different," Grace said. Holding up a smaller notebook bound in dark blue leather, the entries were shorter, more fragmented, as if Emily had been writing in a hurry. Michael leaned closer as Grace read aloud. "She's safe now. It's what matters most. But every time I look at Ethan, I think of her. Would she have his laugh? His curiosity? I made my choice, but I'll never stop wondering if it was the right one." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Michael ran a hand through his hair, his frustration palpable. "She's talking about you," he said finally. "There's no other explanation." Grace nodded, her throat tight. "But why didn't she tell you? Why didn't she fight to keep me?" Michael shook his head, his jaw tightening. Emily was strong, but she wasn't invincible. If she made this choice, there must have been a reason. They continued reading, the pieces of Emily's story slowly falling into place. The entries hinted at a period of turmoil in Emily's life, a time before she met Michael. She had been young, vulnerable, and seemingly caught in circumstances beyond her control. Finally, Grace found a folded letter tucked between the pages of the journal. The envelope was addressed to "My daughter," in Emily's familiar handwriting. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The letter was brief but filled with emotion. "To my dearest Grace, if you ever find this, it means you've come looking for answers. I hope you'll forgive me for the choices I made. I was so young, so afraid. I wanted to keep you, but the world wasn't kind to me then. Giving you up was the hardest thing I've ever done, but I believed it was the only way to give you a better life. You've always been in my heart, even when I couldn't hold you in my arms. Please know that I loved you with everything I had. I hope you found happiness, and I hope you'll understand that everything I did was out of love. Forever yours, Mom." By the time Grace finished reading, tears were streaming down her face. She clutched the letter tightly, her heart breaking and healing all at once. Michael, too, was overcome with emotion. The woman he had loved so deeply had carried this secret, this pain for so long. And now, the truth was finally out. "She loved you," Michael said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "She never stopped." Grace nodded, wiping her tears. "I always wondered if she ever thought about me. Now I know." That evening, Michael called Ethan into the living room. Grace sat beside him on the sofa, her hand resting lightly on her lap. Michael crouched in front of Ethan, his expression serious but warm. "Ethan," Michael began, "there's something I need to tell you. Something about Grace." Ethan's eyes widened slightly, his gaze flicking between his father and Grace. "What is it?" Michael took a deep breath. "Grace is your sister. She's a part of our family, just like you." For a moment, Ethan said nothing, his face unreadable. Then, slowly, a smile spread across his lips. "I knew it," he said, his voice triumphant. Michael blinked. "You knew?" Ethan nodded. "I found Grace's journal a while ago. She wrote about Mom, and I put it together. I didn't say anything because I didn't want to get her in trouble." Grace's eyes widened, and she felt a wave of emotions: pride, relief, and amazement at Ethan's quiet wisdom. "Ethan," Grace said softly, "I'm so glad you know. I wanted to tell you, but I wasn't sure how." Ethan grinned. I'm glad you're my sister. Does this mean you'll stay forever? Grace's heart swelled. Yes, champ, I'm staying. As the evening wore on, the Carter family sat together in the living room, their bond stronger than ever. For the first time in years, the mansion felt like a home, not because of its size or grandeur, but because of the love that now filled its walls. The following days at the Carter mansion felt unlike any other. The heavy, lingering tension that had once defined their lives was gone, replaced by a renewed sense of connection and purpose. For the first time, Michael, Grace, and Ethan began to feel like a family. And one morning, Michael found Ethan and Grace in the garden, crouched among the blooming chrysanthemums. Grace had convinced Ethan to help her plant a few new flowers. Though his energy was limited, she was careful not to push him too hard, encouraging him with gentle words and frequent breaks. Michael stood on the terrace, watching as Ethan beamed up at Grace after pressing a bulb into the soil. "Did I do it right?" Ethan asked, his small hands smudged with dirt. "Perfectly," Grace replied, ruffling his hair. "You've got a green thumb, kiddo." Ethan giggled, his joy contagious. Michael couldn't help but smile as he walked down to join them. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice warm. "Gardening," Ethan said proudly, holding up his muddy hands. "Grace says flowers make everything better." "She's not wrong," Michael said, kneeling beside them. "It's looking good out here." Ethan grinned, then turned to Grace. "Dad should help too." Grace raised an eyebrow, suppressing a laugh. "You think your dad knows how to plant flowers?" Michael smirked. "I'm full of surprises." They spent the next hour working together, the three of them laughing and teasing as they planted rows of colorful bulbs. For Michael, it was a moment of clarity, a reminder of what truly mattered. Grace's presence had brought light back into their lives, and Ethan's laughter was proof that they were finally moving forward. Later that evening, Michael called Grace into his office. She entered cautiously, sensing the seriousness of his demeanor. "Everything okay?" she asked, sitting in the chair across from him. Michael nodded, his expression contemplative. "I've been thinking about everything we've discovered, about Emily, about you, and I've realized something." Grace tilted her head, waiting for him to continue. "She carried this secret for so long," Michael said, his voice heavy with emotion. "But I think it was because she loved us too much to risk losing us. You were a part of her, Grace, and by finding you, it feels like we found a piece of her again." Grace's throat tightened, her heart swelling at his words. "Thank you, Mr. Carter." "Michael," he corrected, a small smile softening his features. "You're family now. You don't have to be so formal." Grace blinked, caught off guard, but nodded. "Michael, thank you." He leaned forward, resting his arms on the desk. "I want you to feel like this is your home. I know I wasn't easy to deal with at first, but I'm grateful for you, for what you've done for Ethan, and for me." Grace's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away quickly. "That means a lot. I've wanted to belong somewhere my whole life, and now, it feels like I do." The following weekend, Michael planned a small celebration for Ethan, something simple yet meaningful to mark their newfound sense of unity. He set up a picnic in the backyard, complete with Ethan's favorite foods, and a small cake decorated with colorful planes. Grace helped Ethan pick out a bright red sweater for the occasion, and when they stepped outside, his face lit up at the sight of the setup. "This is for me?" Ethan asked, his voice filled with wonder. "Of course, buddy," Michael said, kneeling to meet his son's gaze. "You've been so strong, and we wanted to celebrate you." Ethan beamed, throwing his arms around Michael in a rare burst of affection. Michael hugged him tightly, his eyes meeting Grace's over Ethan's shoulder. She smiled, her expression full of warmth and understanding. As they sat on the picnic blanket, sharing stories and laughter, Ethan suddenly looked at Grace with a curious expression. "Grace," he said, "do you think Mom knows we're all together now?" Grace hesitated, glancing at Michael. He gave her a small nod, encouraging her to answer. "I think she does," Grace said softly, "and I think she's really happy about it." Ethan smiled, his gaze turning to the sky. "I hope she can see us." Michael placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "I think she can, buddy, and I think she's proud of you." The three of them sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the golden light of the setting sun casting a warm glow over the yard. For the first time in years, The Carter family felt whole. Later that night, after Ethan had gone to bed, Michael and Grace sat together in the living room, sipping tea and reflecting on the day. "You've done so much for us," Michael said, his voice filled with gratitude. "For Ethan, I don't think I can ever thank you enough." Grace shook her head. "You don't have to thank me. I'm the one who's grateful. I came here looking for answers, but I found something so much more. A family." Michael smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that softened the edges of his usually stern features. "Family," he repeated. "That's what we are now." Grace nodded, her heart full. "Yes, that's what we are," as the night deepened. Michael found himself standing in his office once again, the photograph of Emily and Ethan in his hands. This time, it didn't feel like a relic of a life he had lost. Instead, it felt like a bridge, a connection between the past and the future. Emily had made sacrifices to protect her family, and now, in her absence, Michael was determined to honor her legacy. He looked at the photo one last time before placing it carefully on his desk, a quiet sense of peace settling over him. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. He had his son, his daughter, and the promise of a brighter tomorrow. The weeks that followed the Carter family's newfound unity were marked by a warmth and rhythm the mansion hadn't felt in years. Ethan's health, though still fragile, seemed to stabilize with the love and attention surrounding him. Grace's presence became a cornerstone of their daily lives, her laughter and patience breathing new energy into the once lonely home. One crisp autumn morning, Grace and Ethan sat at the kitchen table, working on a large jigsaw puzzle of a sprawling mountain landscape. Michael entered, the smell of fresh coffee pulling him from his usual early morning solitude. He paused in the doorway, watching the two of them as they leaned over the table, their heads nearly touching as they debated where each piece fit. "This one goes here," Ethan said confidently, placing a piece into the puzzle's edge. "No way," Grace teased, shaking her head. "It doesn't match." Michael chuckled, finally stepping into the room. "I'm with Ethan on this one," Ethan beamed, his smile widening. "See, Grace, Dad knows." Grace raised her hands in mock surrender. "Fine, you win, but if it doesn't fit, you're both doing dishes tonight." Michael raised an eyebrow, a smirk tugging at his lips. "Is that how it works now?" Grace grinned. "House rules." The sound of Ethan's laughter filled the room, and for a moment, Michael let himself bask in the simple joy of the scene. It was these small, everyday moments that reminded him of how far they'd come. Later that day, Michael and Grace took Ethan on a drive into the nearby mountains. It had been years since Michael had ventured outside the mansion for anything other than work. But Grace had convinced him it would be good for Ethan. And for him, the winding roads led them to a quiet overlook, where the golden hues of autumn blanketed the valley below. Grace helped Ethan out of the car, wrapping a scarf around his neck as the brisk wind swept through the air. "Wow," Ethan whispered, his eyes wide as he took in the view. "It's so big." "It is," Grace said, kneeling beside him. "Just like life, it's full of possibilities." Michael stood behind them, his hands in his pockets, watching as Grace pointed out different landmarks in the distance. He felt a pang of gratitude, both for Grace and for the second chance she had unknowingly given their family. "Let's take a picture," Michael said suddenly, pulling out his phone. Grace and Ethan turned, surprised by the suggestion, but immediately agreeing. They stood together, Grace's arm around Ethan's shoulders, as Michael held the phone in front of them. "Say cheese," Michael said, a rare grin spreading across his face. "Cheese!" Ethan shouted, his voice ringing with joy. The camera clicked, capturing the moment, a new beginning etched in pixels. That evening, as they returned home, Ethan fell asleep in the back seat, his head resting against Grace's arm. Michael glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his expression thoughtful. "You've changed everything," he said quietly, his voice almost lost over the hum of the engine. Grace looked up, her brows knitting in confusion. "What do you mean?" "Before you came," Michael continued, "this house felt like a prison. I thought I was doing the best I could for Ethan, but I see now how wrong I was. You brought life back here. You brought us back." Grace's cheeks flushed, but she met his gaze in the mirror. "You were never doing it alone, Michael. You were always fighting for Ethan. I just helped in my own way." Michael nodded, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. You did more than that. You gave him something I couldn't. A chance to feel whole again. After settling Ethan into bed, Michael and Grace found themselves in the living room, each with a cup of tea in hand. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting warm light over the room. Do you ever think about what life might have been like if Emily had told you everything? Grace asked hesitantly. Michael stared into the flames, his jaw tightening briefly. All the time, he admitted. But I've come to realize that dwelling on the past won't change it. What matters now is how we move forward, how we honor her memory. Grace nodded, her gaze thoughtful. She gave up so much to protect me. I want to make her proud. You already have, Michael said, his voice steady, and I think she'd be proud of all of us. The days that followed were filled with quiet joys, family dinners, evenings spent reading together, and moments of shared laughter that slowly filled the once empty halls of the Carter mansion. Grace found herself thinking less about the family she had lost, and more about the one she had found. One night, as Michael stood in his office, he pulled out the photograph they had taken at the Overlook. He placed it beside the one of Emily and Ethan, the two images side by side on his desk. It felt right, as if the two pieces of his life had finally come together, for the first time in years. Michael allowed himself to feel hope, not just for Ethan's future, but for all of them. Grace's arrival had been unexpected, her story almost too extraordinary to believe, but now, he couldn't imagine their lives without her. Thank you, he whispered, his voice barely audible as he gazed at Emily's photo. For bringing her back to us. The Carter family had begun to settle into their new rhythm. But life, as always, had its way of testing even the strongest bonds. Ethan's health, which had seemed stable for weeks, began to waver. His energy waned, and his appetite diminished, causing concern to creep back into the hearts of Michael and Grace. One afternoon, Grace noticed Ethan struggling to focus on his puzzle, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to fit a piece into place. She knelt beside him, her voice soft. "Are you feeling okay, champ?" Ethan looked up, his face pale but determined. "I'm fine, just tired." Grace exchanged a worried glance with Michael, who had been watching from the doorway. He stepped into the room, his jaw tight. "We should call Dr. Bennett." Ethan frowned, clearly not thrilled by the suggestion. "I don't want more tests." "I know," Michael said, crouching beside him. "But we just want to make sure you're okay. It's important." Ethan hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Okay." The next day, they drove to the hospital for Ethan's appointment. The familiar, sterile smell of antiseptic filled the air, and the fluorescent lights seemed harsher than usual. Dr. Bennett greeted them with a warm smile, though his professional demeanor betrayed the seriousness of the situation. "Let's run some tests," he said, his tone reassuring. "We'll figure out what's going on." As Ethan was taken into an exam room, Michael and Grace sat together in the waiting area. The silence between them was heavy, both lost in their thoughts. "He's been through so much," Michael said finally, his voice low. "I hate seeing him like this." Grace placed a hand on his arm, her touch grounding. "He's strong, Michael, and he has us. We'll get through this." Michael looked at her, gratitude flickering in his eyes. "I don't know what we'd do without you." Grace smiled faintly. "You'd manage, you always have. But I'm not going anywhere." Hours later, Dr. Bennett returned with the results. His expression was measured but serious, and Michael's stomach tightened in anticipation. "The tests show some fluctuations in Ethan's immune markers," Dr. Bennett explained. "It's not unexpected for his condition, but it means we need to be cautious. I'm going to adjust his treatment plan and monitor him closely." Michael exhaled slowly, relief mixing with lingering worry. "What can we do to help?" "Keep his stress levels low, make sure he's eating and resting well," Dr. Bennett said, "and continue what you've been doing. The stability and love in his life make a bigger difference than you might realize." Grace nodded, her resolve strengthening. "We'll do whatever it takes." That evening, back at the mansion, Grace found Ethan in his room, curled up under his blanket. She sat beside him, brushing his hair gently with her fingers. "How are you feeling, champ?" she asked. "Tired," Ethan admitted, his voice small. "But okay," Grace smiled, leaning down to kiss his forehead. "Dr. Bennett said you're doing great. We just need to take it easy for a little while." Ethan nodded, his eyelids heavy. Will you stay here until I fall asleep? Of course, Grace said, pulling a chair closer to the bed. I'm not going anywhere. Downstairs. Michael stood in the kitchen, staring out the window into the darkened garden. The weight of the day pressed heavily on his shoulders. He heard Grace's footsteps before she spoke, her voice soft. He's asleep, she said, walking over to join him. He's stronger than we give him credit for. Michael nodded, his gaze distant. I know, but I can't help feeling like I've failed him. You haven't, Grace said firmly, stepping closer. You've done everything you can, and you're here for him every step of the way. That's what matters. Michael turned to her, his eyes reflecting the depth of his emotions. I never thought I'd have to do this alone. After Emily, he trailed off, his voice breaking. You're not alone, Grace said, her voice steady. You have Ethan, and you have me. We're in this together. Michael looked at her, the sincerity in her words breaking through the walls he had built around himself. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe it. The following days were filled with small acts of love and care. Grace made sure Ethan's meals were not only nutritious, but also fun, turning simple dishes into creations that made him smile. Michael took more time away from work, focusing instead on being present for his son. One afternoon, Michael joined Grace and Ethan in the living room, where they were watching an animated movie. Ethan leaned against Grace, his laughter soft but genuine. Dad, Ethan said suddenly, looking over at Michael. Can we go back to the mountains soon? Michael hesitated, his gaze flicking to Grace. She nodded subtly, encouraging him. Of course, Michael said, his voice warm. As soon as you're feeling up for it. Ethan smiled, his eyes lighting up. Promise, Michael said, reaching over to squeeze his son's hand. That night, as Michael sat in his office, he found himself looking at the photograph from the overlook again, the three of them, smiling in the golden light of the setting sun. It wasn't just a picture. It was a reminder of what they had built together. Placing the photo carefully on his desk, Michael made a silent vow. He would fight for his family, just as Emily had, and with Grace by his side, he knew they could face whatever challenges lay ahead. The crisp chill of winter settled over the Carter mansion, snow blanketing the garden in a soft white glow. Inside, the warmth of the family's bond was evident in every corner. Laughter echoed through the halls, the once lifeless home now a place of light and hope. Ethan's health, though still delicate, had shown signs of improvement. With his treatment plan adjusted and the constant love surrounding him, he seemed stronger, both physically and emotionally. Grace and Michael worked as a team, their shared commitment to Ethan deepening the connection between them one morning. As the sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the dining room, Ethan bounded into the kitchen with an excitement that was rare, but always welcome. Dad, Grace, he called, waving a piece of paper in his hand. Look what I made. Michael and Grace turned from their conversation, both smiling as Ethan placed the paper on the counter. It was a drawing, simple but heartfelt. The three of them standing together in front of the mansion, a bright sun shining above them. This is us, Ethan explained proudly. Our family. Michael swallowed hard, the emotion of the moment hitting him with unexpected force. Grace knelt beside Ethan, her voice soft. It's perfect, champ. You think Mom would like it? Ethan asked, his voice quieter now. Michael crouched to meet his son's gaze, his expression gentle. I think she'd love it, buddy. She'd be so proud of you. Ethan grinned, throwing his arms around Michael's neck. I love you, Dad. I love you too, kiddo, Michael said, his voice thick with emotion, as Ethan turned to show Grace another detail in his drawing. Michael met her eyes over his son's head. They shared a look of understanding, one that spoke of all they had been through, and the unspoken promise to keep moving forward. Later that day, the family bundled up in coats and scarves and ventured outside to the garden. The snow crunched beneath their boots as they built a snowman together, Ethan's laughter filling the cold air. Grace placed the finishing touch, a crooked top hat, on the snowman's head, earning a round of applause from Ethan. Best snowman ever, Ethan declared, his cheeks flushed with cold and happiness. Michael chuckled, brushing snow off his gloves. I think he needs a name. Frosty, Ethan said decisively, then looked up at Grace. Right. Absolutely. Grace agreed, giving the snowman an approving nod. As the afternoon faded into evening, they returned to the warmth of the house. Grace prepared hot chocolate for everyone, complete with whipped cream and sprinkles, while Michael lit a fire in the living room. They settled onto the sofa. Ethan nestled between them, his head resting on Grace's shoulder. "This is nice," Ethan murmured, his voice drowsy. "It is," Michael agreed, glancing at Grace. "It really is." As Ethan drifted off to sleep, Grace gently pulled a blanket over him. Michael watched her, his gratitude for her presence growing with each passing day. "Grace," he said quietly, "I don't think I've ever said it outright, but thank you for everything." Grace looked at him, her expression soft. "You don't have to thank me, Michael. We're family. This is where I'm meant to be." Michael nodded, her words resonating deeply. For so long he had believed he was alone in his struggles, that the weight of responsibility was his to bear. But now, with Grace by his side, he realized how much lighter the burden felt. That night, after Ethan had been tucked into bed, Michael stood in his office, gazing at the photographs on his desk. The picture of Emily and Ethan, now joined by the one of him. Grace and Ethan at the overlook. The juxtaposition of the past and present felt fitting, two pieces of a puzzle that had finally come together. As he stared at the images, a sense of peace settled over him. Emily's sacrifices had paved the way for this moment, and though she wasn't there to see it, Michael knew she would have been proud of the family they had become. Grace's soft knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. She stepped inside, her presence as steadying as ever. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, her voice gentle. Michael shook his head. "Just thinking. Good thoughts, I hope," Grace said. Smiling, Michael returned the smile, something that had become easier over the past weeks. "Yeah, good thoughts." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, the weight of everything they had endured giving way to the quiet promise of a brighter future, as the snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the world in stillness. The Carter family stood at the brink of a new beginning. They had faced loss, uncertainty, and the weight of hidden truths. But together, they had found strength, love, and the power of redemption. For Michael, Grace, and Ethan, the future was no longer something to fear. It was something to embrace. They were at last a family, and that was enough.